Hello everyone, this is Mathfinder, the home for every math nerd's Pathfinder optimization needs. If you're new here, welcome, and we're so glad to have you. If you've been here before, welcome back, and thank you so much for your continued support. So this video is a consequence of something I learned while I was getting ready for part 3 of the Blaster Caster series. Parts 1 and 2 are linked above. While I was writing out the build guide, I noticed that there were a few tactics that I use that I sort of take for granted and everyone in my parties takes for granted, but they're not necessarily standard across all players. Blasting, just like anything else in Pathfinder, can be tactically complex. So I figured that it's a good idea to release a primer on the sorts of tactics I expect blasters to be using before actually releasing the build guide so that you know how to play these characters without needing to guess at some of my assumptions. It's also worth noting that even if you're a caster who's not a dedicated blaster, but you still blast some of the time, it's a good idea to keep these tactics in mind. They may help inform when it's a good idea to blast and when it's not. To first get something seemingly obvious out of the way, blasting is an important role. Blasting is something that a party benefits from, and it's useful and it's powerful. It may not seem like something that needs to be mentioned, but I have seen enough people just outright dismiss blasting. I don't think it's a majority of people dismissing it, but it's enough that I feel the need to address it. Some folks view blasting as being irrelevant, unimportant, kind of a sideshow to what their main character marshals do, and I just don't think it's true. There are many justifications used for it, so I'm going to go through them a little. The first is that casters can only do good area of effect damage, and their single target damage is irrelevant. Now, suffice it to say, I don't think that's true. I can't go in depth into my argument in this video, but I will link a video above where I do talk about single target blasting and how it compares to ranged martial damage, and you'll see it's quite comparable. This is often followed up by the claim that, well, casters can only do AOE, and AOE is only useful against mooks, and mooks are not a threat anyways, so the caster's main damaging shtick is irrelevant. A single mook may not be a threat, but that's neither here nor there. The encounter building rules never tell the GM to throw a single mook at you unless it's intended to be a joke fight. A group of mooks can just be a relevant threat. A severe encounter composed of many lower level enemies is still a severe encounter. At low levels, it may not feel as threatening as a boss fight, but it's still threatening. It can still take out a character. An extreme threat encounter can still be lost. More importantly, in the hands of a particularly tactical GM, you'll notice that groups of mooks can utilize their own teamwork against you. That agency is not present when your party outnumbers the boss they plan to use. So these groups of enemies are threats, so even if a blaster can only do AoE, that's still a pretty good role to be filling, because that's not a role everyone can fill easily. The other reason this gets dismissed is because people make this assumption that equal or lower level enemies will die really quickly in a couple of hits from a marshal. And that, to me, is a symptom of low level play. At low levels, a strength-based marshal can 1 or 2 shot most on or lower level enemies. This is when you're in the level 1 to 2 range, by the way. As early as level 3 or 4, it won't be a 1 shot anymore. It'll probably still be a 2 shot. As early as level 5, you're really not taking down an enemy without some focus fire, even a significantly lower level one. And by the time you reach level 7 or 8, even coordinated focus fire may not be enough to take down an enemy. This is especially true for on-level enemies or enemies who are only 1 or 2 levels under you, because you can't count on critting them all that much. That also makes these enemies some of the deadliest you face. An extreme threat encounter composed of enemies who are very close to you in level, and multiple of them, can really wreck you. In a nutshell, anyone who's played Pathfinder knows boss fights get easier as you level up. When you're low level, you can get one shot by a boss, and now you're kind of on a death spiral, but once you're higher level, you have more agency in the battle. Well, the same is true for lower level mooks. Once your strength marshals are no longer one-shotting them, they have more agency in the battle. They have scarier actions and activities and action compression. They have scarier reactions. They have more ways of using their own teamwork against you and debuffing you, and so on and so forth. In fact, I would say at higher levels, I find waves of enemies significantly more deadly than a single centerpiece boss monster. Just the other day in my curtain call game, we had what I think may have been the hardest fight we've faced in the past 6 or 7 levels, and it was just 4 mooks, each of them 2 levels lower than us, and a haunt, which I suspect was on our level. That's all it took to really threaten a level 17 party. So I don't really buy the idea that AoE is irrelevant because mooks are irrelevant. I think that is something that's only really true at levels 1 to 2, and the game kind of signposts this by just not making that much AoE available at low levels. You can really just use Electric Arc and Slashing Gust as your AoE options at levels 1 to 2 and move on from there. The third and final argument I wanted to address is that AoEs do not help you focus fire. They do a small amount of damage, and since it's split among many targets, it doesn't help you focus fire, and what you should be doing instead is buffing your marshals so they will focus fire the minions. And yes, the buffing the marshals part is almost always the end goal of this argument. This argument is always used as a justification to tell spellcasters to support marshals rather than blast. And this argument, I'm going to be a little less kind to it than the previous two, because the previous two arguments are based on truth. When somebody says casters don't do good single target damage, there is some truth to that. A caster that is not specifically built for it will not do good single target damage. Likewise, when someone says mooks die really quickly, they're not a threat, and there's no real need to AoE them with your spell slots, that is true at levels 1 to 2, and a little less true at levels 3 to 4. So if a new player comes to the game, hasn't yet gotten to level 5, and makes this claim, they're not trying to mislead you. They're just saying what's been their experience. They don't know that their experience is going to change at level 5. But this argument in specific, is almost always based on bad math or logic. It is not reflective of actual play. If you just cast a single fireball once, you will probably notice that it's not reflective of actual play. And yet it is used as a justification to tell casters that they should never blast, even in the situations blasting is optimal in, and that they should support instead. This bad logic or math, it's always something along these lines. Enemies will always succeed on their saving throw. Fireball does 10 damage to an enemy who succeeded. 10 damage is irrelevant, therefore you should go cheerlead the marshals. You should not be blasting. There is another version of this that tries to back itself up with math. It looks something like, against a level 4 target, your average DPR will be 15.75 with the fireball. Enemies have 60 HP. You only took 15 of it. Therefore, your damage was irrelevant. Therefore, you should just go cheerlead the marshals. And it's not true. The math does not reflect what actually casting a blasting spell looks like. Intuitively, just ask yourself, what does 15.75 really mean in terms of a blast? What is an average? An average just means if across 100 fights, you tally up the number of times you hit 3 targets, add it all up, and divide it by 100, you're going to get 15.75. What does that tell you? What does that tell you about how this fight is going to go? What does that tell you about how useful Fireball was in this fight? It doesn't tell you anything about that. That being said, I'm not just going to tell you DPR is a bad metric for evaluating AoEs, and then not tell you how to evaluate AoEs. That would be pretty silly on my part. So let's do a little bit of setup. We're going to just run with the same setup that this average DPR case used. It's a level 5 spellcaster. Their DC is 21. The enemies are all level 4. They have a plus 11 to their saving throw. And you're throwing a fireball at 3 of them. What does the math for that end up looking like? So the math is going to be on this weird looking chart. Each of the labels at the bottom is labeling a single set of outcomes. So for example, 0003 means 0 crit fails, 0 fails, 0 successes, and 3 critical successes. Likewise, 2100 means 2 crit fails, 1 fail, 0 successes, and 0 crit successes. So each of the labels is 4 numbers going up in the degrees of success and telling you how many of your targets got any one of those degrees. The vertical green line near the left of the graph, it is basically splitting the chart into a positive and negative section. Everything to its left is bad. Your fireball practically feels like it was wasted. Everything to its right is good because at least 1 target failed. Why the whole at least 1 target fail thing matters will become clear as I go through blasting tactics throughout this video. For now, take my word for it. In any case, if you were previously convinced by the whole, oh, enemies always succeed, therefore you should expect your fireball to just do 10 damage to everyone argument, It's immediately debunked. Look at the top two most frequent outcomes. At 30% and 24% respectively, we have the cases where one enemy fails and two succeed, or two enemies fail and one succeed. And yes, 3 successes is the third most common outcome, but it's really far behind in its probability compared to the other two. The odds of you seeing 3 successes are about half of the odds of you seeing 2 fails and 1 success. And 2 fails and 1 success is a really good outcome to be having. And then if you look at all the outcomes left of 3 successes, 2 successes plus 1 critical success happens around 4-ish% of the time. The remaining 2 where multiple enemies critically succeed are vanishingly small. On the other hand, outcomes where 1 or more enemies fail can happen repeatedly. For example, look at 1110. The outcome where 1 enemy crit failed and 1 enemy failed is actually more likely than the outcome in which 2 enemies succeeded and 1 crit succeeded. You could keep staring at this graph. You could pause the video and just look at the buckets. No matter what angle you look at these buckets from, the only valid conclusion is that, yeah, most of the time an enemy is going to be failing their saving throw, not succeeding. Now, the chart, all on its own, fully debunks the whole idea that enemies will always succeed. You can simply inspect the chart and know that's not true. More often than not, there'll be at least 1 failure. But what about the DPR analysis? That looks like it makes more sense. So does it have any grain of truth to it? It doesn't. And it's, in fact, kind of misleading. So first, let's look at the odds that at least one of the 3 targets is going to fail or critically fail. That comes out to around 83.36%. Likewise, the chance that at least one creature critically fails is 14.26%. If you need convincing on those being good odds, it wouldn't be uncommon for a marshal to run up to someone and say hit them on an 8, which means they crit on an 18, 19, or 20. 15% of the time, roughly the same as 14%. Now, the difference between you and that marshal is that your fireball, where one of the targets crit fails 15% of the time, the other 2 still might take damage, whereas the marshal who ran up and hit someone just hit that someone. So these are really good odds, especially on the failure side. Now, let's assume the enemy has 60 HP. If they fail, you're going to do 6d6 damage, which within 1 standard deviation is 17 to 21 damage. That leaves them with 35 to 43 HP. You took about a third of their health bar while still poking away at everyone else, and now the rest of your party members can bring them down relatively easily. It will take focus fire, but they'll do it. If an enemy critically fails, they're typically left with 10 to 26 HP, because within 1 standard deviation, double of 6d6 is going to do 34 to 50 damage. At this point, a single ally can comfortably bring them down. If they're on the higher side of that range, it might take a melee ally, it might take 2 strikes or a lucky crit. If they're on the lower side of that range, almost any party member can fairly easily bring them down. And now you can start to see why the DPR was misleading. When you look at the actual damage enemies took, there's a very high likelihood that there's someone in the group you just fireballed that can be focus fire, that can be taken out of the action economy. Whereas if you try to boil that down to 15.75 DPR, round that down to 15 damage because you can deal 0.75, the enemy is left with 45 HP. If you visually see this as every one of your 3 enemies being left with 45 HP, there is no single target that is favorable to be focus fired. They're all going to be harder to focus fire down than anyone left with the 35 to 40 HP range, and they definitely can be one-shot like the enemies on the lower end of the crit fail range. And remember, crit fails happen 14% of the time. Context that's erased by using DPR here. So this is why I find DPR to be so misleading for AoEs. It is artificially erasing the swinginess of having 4 degrees of success, and by erasing that swinginess, you're kind of making it look like the fireball is not going to shorten the combat, because dealing 15 damage to everyone has a very good chance of not really shortening the combat, whereas the options that actually happen at the table most of the time will shorten combat meaningfully. You can repeat these calculations from any level between levels 3 all the way to level 20, and it will hold true. AoE will meaningfully shorten a combat if you use the actual metrics that reflect how it plays out at the table, but it will look like it doesn't if you rely on DPR to tell you the answer. All of that math, it's really there to lead us to what is the first and most basic tactic that blaster casters can use with their AoEs. Focus Fire. Focus Fire is the most baseline tactic you can use on a blaster caster. This is the way it works in general. You throw out an AoE at a group of enemies. This runs a high chance of spiking a bunch of upfront damage. Remember, the spike of damage is close to what you can do single target in melee, but it doesn't run a risk of whiffing. You're most likely going to get that spike on one of your many targets, and the other targets will take some poke. Once the fireball is resolved, your allies should be prioritizing targets who took a lot of damage. If there's an enemy who failed, they might need focus fire from all of your damage dealers to finish the job. If there's an enemy who crit failed, a single ally might be able to spike some damage on that enemy, drop him, and somebody else can focus the rest of the foes. This was obvious from the previous slide. But what do you do in the meantime? What are your tactics like? You should be continuing to soften up other targets and or landing kills wherever likely. In the vast majority of cases, your friends can take out anyone who failed or critically failed all by themselves. So you should be prioritizing ones who took half damage. Soften them up for future rounds focus fire. So let's say you fireballed 3 targets as before. One of them failed. Your melee friends might go run after the one that failed and take them out of the combat. You then perhaps electric arc the remaining 2. If they both succeeded, that's fine, because 2 successful saves is still going to bring them into the threshold where one of them can be focus fired. And then you can decide what to do for the last target. Are you going to cantrip them, use a focus spell, do something else? It can depend on the situation. But all of that is for being at the top of initiative. What if you're significantly later in initiative? Let's keep running with that previous example. There are 3 enemies, they all have 60 HP. Your friends run up to 1, and they dealt 40-ish damage to that enemy. There's 20 HP left. What do you do now? Your intuition is probably screaming at you that now is a good time to use a single target spell to focus down that 119 HP enemy, right? Wrong, believe it or not. It's really unintuitive, but it's actually still better to stick to AoE. Let me explain. The first piece of the puzzle is that the odds of a single enemy failing their save don't really change if you're using a single target spell or a multi-target spell. Remember, the odds we discussed in the previous section were all about one of many enemies failing. But when you're looking at just the one enemy, whether they got hit by a Thunderstrike directly or whether they got caught in a fireball that was hitting 3 people, there's still exactly the same chance of failing, 40% in this case. Of course, I know you could target a lower saving throw, and that is something to consider, but let's set that aside for a moment. So if the odds don't change, what actually changes? The damage. The damage is what changes. Fireball does an average of 21 damage, plus or minus 4-ish. Thunderstrike deals an average of 27 damage, plus or minus 6-ish. So you should only be using Thunderstrike if you suspect that the enemy is at an HP threshold where you're unlikely to kill them with the fireball. But enemy HP is not open information. So yes, if the enemy was at exactly 13 HP, you should be Thunderstriking them, because even on a success, they're most likely going to die. But that's not true for Fireball, right? But you don't know the enemy's at 13 HP. Likewise, if they're at 26 HP, Fireball is very unlikely to kill them even on a failure. But a Thunderstrike is gonna kill them most of the time on a failure. But you don't know they're at 26 HP. So there are going to be moments when you might guesstimate the enemy's HP, and that HP is in one of those thresholds where a Thunderstrike is significantly likelier to kill than a Fireball, but most of the time you won't know what HP the enemy's at. You might just suspect that Fireball might kill them or Thunderstrike might kill them. And in that case, you should still be going with Fireball, because suppose you have guesstimated wrong. Suppose Thunderstrike doesn't kill on a success. You kind of wasted 2 actions. If you didn't take the enemy out of the action economy, they get their 3 actions, and on their following turn, at best, maybe you saved your friends 1 action. Maybe they would have taken 2 strikes to kill this enemy, instead they took 1 strike. But with Fireball, you have a chance of spiking the damage on this enemy, the same chance of spiking the damage as Thunderstrike did, and you have a high chance that 2 other targets are taking some damage. So Fireball is just a really good floor to be using in these cases, even when you're going low in initiative. Even when you cannot enable somebody else's focus fire, you should still be going for those spikes. The worst case scenario for you is softening up multiple targets, whereas for Thunderstrike, the worst case scenario for you is kind of doing nothing to this one target by softening him up to a blow that was already going to kill him. So despite how unintuitive it is, spike damage AoEs, big bursts of upfront damage from AoEs, is one of the best ways of focus firing down enemies in multi-target scenarios, regardless of where you are in initiative. The next major tactic I wanted to talk about is treating some single target spells as if they have a multi-target rider effect. Wait, what? What am I talking about? Why would AoE be a rider effect? Isn't AoE the main point? Believe it or not, no. Some spells are designed to be good enough as single target blasts, but they just happen to have an AoE option attached. Some examples of this are Floating Flame, Cinder Swarm, Lightning Bolt, and this is going to be my spiciest take, Chain Lightning. I know Chain Lightning is viewed as a premier AoE option by the community. I don't think Paizo views it as such. I think Paizo views it as a single target spell that happens to hit many targets when you get lucky. If you don't believe me, first compare Lightning Bolt to Thunderstrike heightened to 3rd rank. They both deal about the same damage. This is because Lightning Bolt isn't really going to hit that many targets as an AoE. It's a line. You're going to hit 2-ish enemies most of the time. Chain Lightning does exactly the same damage as a 6th rank Thunderstrike. I think it's very clear that Paizo balanced it as a single target spell, and it kind of makes sense because it is a high risk spell. Let's get into that. What differentiates these spells from just say a burst AoE like Fireball is that they carry a significant risk attached to them in terms of their multi-target capabilities. Floating Flame moves 10 feet at a time. You're probably not going to hit more than 1 to 2 foes with it. If you do wish to hit more than 1 to 2 foes with it, you're going to have to sustain a second time in that round, which means you're probably not casting another spell in that round. That doesn't tend to be a very profitable exchange, so you're probably not going to be doing it very much. Likewise, Cinder Swarm is an emanation centered on your single target. On a medium-sized enemy, this is 9 squares in your AoE, relatively small. And Lightning Bolt is a line, which, as we already talked about, usually only hits 2 targets, so you're rarely gonna hit more than 2 to 3 foes with these spells. And then there's Chain Lightning. Chain Lightning has a high risk of ending within the first 2 to 4 foes. It's not a massive risk, it's not the majority of the time, but it's still significantly more of a risk than it would be with a burst. I did this comparison in my Dehydrate video. Let's say you're fighting 6 or so enemies. The odds that 3 or more of them will be taking 0 damage come around 18%. Those are really high odds, and no burst spell is going to have those odds. The odds of more than half of them crit succeeding would be minuscule. I'm talking under 1%. So Chain Lightning is encoded as having a significant risk in the game's balance, and that's how you should treat it too. All of these spells we're talking about here are ones where you bring them to the table fully ready to use them in a single target scenario, and if they happen to multi-target, great, that's amazing. These spells are basically multi-tools for exactly that reason, and that makes them really attractive for prepared spellcasters. A spontaneous spellcaster usually doesn't run into a situation where they have to use a mediocre spell for anything. For example, if you're a sorcerer, you might just have Thunderstrike and Fireball both as signature spells. When you face a crowd of enemies, Fireball them. When you face a single enemy, Thunderstrike them. Simple enough. If you're a wizard and you prepare 1 slot for Fireball, 1 slot for Thunderstrike, and the 3rd slot for something or the other, you might just be in a situation where you use Thunderstrike in Combat 1, in Combat 2 you're wishing you had Thunderstrike, but now you're forced to use Fireball instead. These spells do a really good job mitigating that. I talk a lot about multimodal spells in my Prepared Spellcasters guide, which I will link above, but basically a single spell that can fulfill multiple roles just tends to be an all-star on all Prepared Spellcasters. These basically define a more single-minded version of Focus Fire. You're hitting fewer targets, but you're going to be doing more damage, which means you're much likelier to create those scenarios where an enemy is within one shot of being killed rather than two, within one friend's focus fire of being killed rather than two, and so on. One thing to note is that these spells also tend to be exceptionally useful when you're low in initiative. On the previous slide, we talked about how when you're low in initiative, Fireball is still more attractive than Thunderstrike because you don't know exactly how much HP the enemy has. But I would say Fireball is less attractive than Lightning Bolt or Chain Lightning in these scenarios, because now you can line up the situation so that this enemy is much likelier to die than from the Fireball, while still having a good chance of dealing damage to 1, 2, or more other targets, which is really nice. Another really nice thing about these spells is they tend to scale better into higher levels. I will be talking about the scaling problem of AOEs later on in this video, but just remember that these spells tend to be exceptions for a little longer than their burst or cone counterparts. Floating Flame is relevant all the way up till you pick Cinder Swarm, which is its direct replacement, and Cinder Swarm is going to be relevant the entire level range. Lightning Bolt is relevant all the way up till you pick Chain Lightning, and then it's going to stay relevant for most levels after that point. So all in all, single target spells that happen to hit multiple targets are a great part of a caster's toolkit. It gives them flexibility. It gives them the ability to have a multi-target spell that can still be very high upside when it gets many targets in it. It gives them agency in situations where a burst is not quite likely to kill a target that's already been focused down. These spells are staples for a reason. The last basic tactic I want to talk about is fire and forget tactics. This is actually starkly different than the previous two. Both of the previous two tactics I talked about were about focus fire. This one is different. In a nutshell, you're asking the question, how do I use Dehydrate instead of Fireball? For Fireball, it's just standard focus fire tactics as we've been discussing. For Dehydrate, let's say 4 targets were targeted with the Dehydrate, 1 failed and 3 crit succeeded. Unless the enemy that failed immediately succeeds on their flat check and recovers, you are incentivized to just let them stay burning. You're going to do a chunk of damage to them. It's not going to take any additional action cost. Your party should just be focusing down one of the other targets now. This way, Dehydrate can passively rack up value in the background. Other persisting damage spells like Floating Flame, Cinder Swarm can also define fire and forget tactics. I know I listed them under the previous one, which was all about focus fire, single-mindedly focus firing even, but persisting damage spells are actually quite flexible. The whole idea here is that you only use them when enemies are expected to stay alive for multiple turns. You're never going to cast Floating Flame if it looks like this combat is going to end in 2 rounds. You're going to do it if it feels like this combat is a boss and 2 high-level minions. You're going to use it when the combat looks like 2 enemies who are 1 level above your party. In these kinds of fights, persisting damage gives your party the agency to choose between focus fire and forget and fire. And you can make this decision moment to moment. On round 1, you might just use this as poke damage, and honestly, your party might not even start focusing on any one of the targets yet. They might just focus on whoever's closest to them. Then over time, you'll see, maybe someone spikes a bad crit fail, the party's going to switch and focus fire them. Maybe no one is failing, maybe they keep succeeding. And at that point, you have the agency to decide, maybe you need to spend 1 more spell slot, try to get that big spike so someone goes down, or alternatively, you can just continue racking up value over time and just not try to focus down someone on any given round. So this moment-to-moment decision-making enables fire and forget tactics when they're relevant. So when are they relevant? Because our intuition tells us focus fire is always better, right? Because it takes enemies out of the initiative quickly. But there are times when you can't rely on taking an enemy out of the initiative quickly. First off, just sheer party composition might prevent that from happening. Not every party has spike damage dealers who operate in melee. I know online discourse often revolves around fighters, barbarians, maguses, and buffing them and making sure they can spike damage as much as possible. But a party with a monk as a sole frontliner exists. I am GMing for one currently. There are parties where a war priest and a champion are the only frontliners. There's also parties where the damage mostly comes from range, which means it can't be quite that spiky unless you have a gunslinger or a starlet span magus. There are many combinations of parties that cannot guarantee taking enemies out of the initiative right away on round 1. And if you cannot guarantee doing that on round 1, you should be considering forget and fire tactics, because these tactics might enable a faster, more efficient kill on a later round. Now, I will say at lower levels, focus fire is almost always better, because again, at levels 1 to 2, most enemies can get one shot. Why would you spread out damage over just trying to take their HP down to 0 right away? And even at levels 3 to 4, they're not going down in one shot, but they're still fairly easy to focus fire, even for a party that's not good at spike damage. So only in the rare case where you can expect the enemy to last a long time, you should use fire and forget at low levels, but mostly focus fire. At mid-high levels though, fire and forget becomes a more valuable tactic to consider, especially if your party composition cannot deliver tons of spike damage. This again goes into the scaling problem of AOEs. As you go up in levels, you have to adapt to those higher levels, and that is going to be the next topic we're talking about. So what is this menacing impact of level that I keep alluding to? As you level up, a few things will change, and they will impact how you blast. The first and most obvious change is that HP grows faster than damage scaling in this game. Level 14 enemies, for example, have 255 HP. An 8th rank Eclipse Burst is going to deal an average of 28% of that. On the previous slide, the Fireball was dealing an average of 35% of that. And remember, it's not just you, it's not just your AoEs. Martial damage now also represents a smaller chunk of HP pools than it used to. So not only is it harder for you to soften up a target for your friends to focus fire, it is also harder for those friends to focus fire them. Now, of course, this is not some impossible to mitigate problem. As martials level up, they will get features that give them action compression that help them do more damage that keeps up with the HP pools. As casters level up, some of the features will scale with them. For example, Eclipse Burst might be having its damage boosted by Sorceress Potency. The caster might have a Wand of Shardstorm, adding a bunch of passive damage to whatever they're going to do. They might have specialty wands. There are a lot of things that change at higher levels that make sure your damage fall off is not too aggressive, but it does exist, and it is something that you should consider. You can't just blindly blast a fireball at a bunch of enemies and expect the same amount of focus fire to work at this level as it did at level 5. Secondly, monsters tend to have deadlier action economies at higher levels. They have auras, they have reactions, they have aggressive ways of compressing a lot of damage onto a very small number of actions. This means action denial is actually more valuable at high levels than it is at low levels. Remember that at low levels, preventing an action might just be preventing a map strike, whereas at high levels, preventing an action might be preventing something disastrous from happening, preventing a 3-action activity from happening. Finally, the raw numerical advantage of being higher level than your foe kinda tapers off. It's still there, like you're still roughly plus 1.5 in stats ahead for every level you have on someone, but it's just the impact of that gets smoothed out by all of these other factors. So you can't expect to burst down enemies quite that easily unless your whole party is coordinatedly doing so and focusing exclusively on burst damage. And of course, if your party is using that coordination, it is able to get that level of burst down, that's great, but most parties don't do that, and it's not necessarily the best way to approach every single combat anyways, even if your party can do that. So this has a few consequences on blasting tactics. The obvious, you can no longer expect focus fire to shift the action economy quite as quickly as it used to. The next is that fire and forget spells get a lot more valuable. You might think that even if the enemy's not going down on round 1, it's probably still the best idea to focus fire them so they go down on round 2, right? But is it? Think about it for a moment. The one you were focus firing was the one that failed. What happened to the other enemies? They succeeded on their saving throw. They're going to be even harder to focus down than the one that failed because you didn't do that much damage to them as a chunk of their HP. They're going to be active for more turns. This combat might go to round 5 if you just try to focus them down one by one. But if you do a fire and forget spell of some kind, you throw out that dehydrate, one of them fails or crit fails and doesn't immediately pass their flat check. They take damage in the background, your party members start focusing others. Maybe the first target to go down will not go down on round 2. Maybe they'll go down on round 3. but the remaining ones will start cascading like dominoes soon after because your spell has been doing work in the background. You have not just done one burst of success to them. You have been constantly racking up damage over time. So damage over time becomes much more valuable at higher levels, as I mentioned on the Fire and Forget slide. That being said, one of the scariest parts of this tactic is that whatever enemies you're racking up damage over time on are active. They're just doing their thing, and that's terrifying at these high levels. You want to take enemies and make them stop doing their thing as quickly as possible. And this is where debuff riders attached to blasts kind of become mandatory, since they impact enemies up front. Remember, the reason Focus Fire is considered good in multi-target situations is because it takes somebody to 0 HP. Once they're at 0, they're out of the action economy. But when you're in a situation where you cannot reliably bring people down to 0 HP on round 1, a rider that takes away an action on round 1 is really nice. A rider that debuffs those actions round 1 is really nice. You're at least slowing down the enemy up front. And then while they're being slowed down, you're racking up damage and potentially killing them on round 2. So in this way, you're sort of stemming the bleeding of letting them survive through round 1. Finally, blasts with built-in zoning capabilities become much more valuable because they let you divide and conquer. If you divide and conquer these fights, you can prevent all of the advantages I mentioned earlier from snowballing. So these are a few of the ways blasting tactics change, and now we'll get into that. We have already talked about Fire and Forget spells, so I don't want to go into too much more detail there, but I am going to talk about debuff riders and zoning. Next up, we'll be talking about blasting tactics for spells with debuff riders. Now let's briefly cover low levels. Briefly because high levels are the real meat of this conversation. At low levels, debuff riders tend to not be that good in AoE situations. Full blasts enable better focus fire. Full debuffs usually more harshly impact enemies. In single target situations, they can still be quite nice. And ignite fireworks thrown at a boss is good. It's not good in a multi-target situation, but it's decent against a boss. So depending on the situation, you might end up using it. Now, at higher levels is where it gets interesting. At higher levels, they often create a similar gameplay loop to Fire and Forget spells. Why is that? As mentioned before, Focus Fire is good because it takes enemies out of the action economy, but you're not reliably doing that anymore. Rider effects help deny enemy actions up front. The more harsh the penalty you apply to the enemy, the easier it is for your party to just ignore them. If you're just knocking them prone, maybe you can't ignore them. But if you're doing something that takes them out of combat for 1 or 2 rounds, it's safe to ignore them, focus other targets. If you're doing something that potentially takes them entirely out of combat, just fully ignore them. So that's how debuff riders tend to be similar to Fire and Forget spells. And that is how they help make up for the lack of the focus fire tactics falling off as you've been leveling up. Now, one thing to note is that riders can be on a different part of the spell depending on where you look. Sometimes they're on a success. Sometimes they're on a failure. Sometimes they're on a critical failure. Sometimes they require successive critical failures and failures. How do you evaluate these options? So first, if the rider is happening on a failure, it's okay for the spell to do below par damage. Why is that? Because failures are super common. As you saw in the first few slides, when you AoE 3 targets, you can expect 83% of the time that at least one will fail. That number is not going to be going down as you level up. And the number goes up if you have more and more targets. So riders on failures are actually quite reliable. That's why it's okay for the spell to just do below par damage. As an example, Elemental Breath or Geyser, which can knock enemies prone. They do a little less damage than an on-rank spell would, but that's okay because they knock enemies prone on a failure. Vitrifying Blast, which slows an enemy and then potentially vitrifies an enemy over the course of 3 rounds, okay for it to do less damage. Phantasmagoria, less damage than Falling Stars, but it confuses enemies, and confused enemies cannot take reactions, cannot cast spells, cannot use meta strikes, and they're attacking targets at random, so pretty safe to ignore them. In particular, you'll notice Vitrifying Blast and Phantasmagoria really create that Fire and Forget tactic that I was talking about. The next category would be spells that do above par damage, but they have a very unreliable rider. Maybe it only happens on a critical failure. Maybe on a critical failure, there's a follow-up save, which they also have to fail before that rider is applied. The best example of this category of spells is Eclipse Burst. On a critical failure, enemies are blinded. Anything else, there's no debuff attached, but that's okay. Eclipse Burst does a lot of damage, so if no one crit failed, you didn't lose very much. There wasn't a high opportunity cost for this. So both of these first two categories of spells are excellent to be AoEing with. The third category is when none of the above are true. In these cases, the spell is best reserved for an exceptionally large number of targets. Now you might ask, why reserve them for those at all? Why not just use one of the other two categories, which are always good? And that might be the right answer for, say, a prepared spellcaster who can't afford to be caught with this spell slot in a situation that isn't good for it. But those rider effects that these spells have, because they're being penalized in two different directions, the riders tend to be some of the best. Here are some examples. Now, Arrow Salvo, I don't know why I put her on the list. Its rider effect sucks. Let's pretend I didn't put it there. Beheading Buzzsaw. If an enemy critically fails and then also fails, they just die. They're just gone. No further action spent. Everyone else still took damage, but one enemy just up and died. So Beheading Buzzsaw, a great spell if you're somehow able to catch 4 or 5 targets in a line. Phantasmal Calamity. This spell on the rider, the enemy is stunned for a round, which means they lose all their reactions, free actions, and actions for that round. And then they get one more saving throw to get out of it, and if they fail, they're stunned for another round, and so on and so forth. Again, if there's like 7 or 8 targets, throw a Phantasmal Calamity. One of them is probably going to crit fail, and likely fail after that, and then they're just out. This is great for fire and forget tactics. You take somebody out up front, focus fire others, and then when that person you have forgotten comes back, they still crit failed against a ton of damage, so they're going to be very easy to take out of combat. And of course, there is the fourth category of spells, the ones that do their debuff on a successful saving throw, like Ignite Fireworks. And these are good. These are just a low risk, low ceiling option. You only use it if you're really risk averse in a given situation, because they will most likely do something to every single target, but they're not going to excel in any of the areas. And I think at higher levels, I prefer one of these options because they excel when used. Whereas with the low risk, low peak options, you're unlikely to find an excellent result. I think weaponizing the swinginess of the 4 degrees of success tends to be the best way for an AoE user to play. The next category I wanted to talk about is zoning spells. When you go into higher spell ranks, a lot of blasts are really just zones of control that you create. Wall of Fire, Rust Cloud, Freezing Rain, Corrosive Muck, Awaken Entropy, all of these are just huge areas of telling enemies that they're not allowed to stay here. In this regard, blasters have a lot of crossover with battlefield controllers in high-level play. And just like with debuff riders, the value of zoning for a blaster is impacting the action economy right away, so that softening targets over time is less of a stressful task, and you don't need to try to 1 or 2 round kill everyone. However, unlike debuff riders, using zoning options to maximum effect does not just come from you. It needs to come from the whole party planning and preparing to make good use of these zoning options. And when they do, it'll feel amazing. It's basically a way to get a default win, but unlike other D20 games, it actually takes some degree of planning and preparation to make sure that that happens. At a baseline, you have to make sure you're not using these spells carelessly. The difficult terrain from Freezing Rain might slow your friends down. The Rust Cloud will apply concealment that your friends may not be able to deal with. The Wall of Fire or the Corrosive Muck, your friends might need to go around them. All of these can hamper your allies' action economy and undo the advantage you generated by hampering the enemy's action economy, so stay aware of this. Now, the planning and preparation for each of these spells tends to be fairly spell-specific and party-specific, but I'm going to talk about some general guidelines that'll inform how you communicate with your party and decide what to do. First, if there's damage that happens when a creature enters or starts in the area, you should coordinate with your party to use force movement options that help you double dip on these areas. The enemy moves through your Wall of Fire, takes a bit of damage, you shove them back in, they take a bit of damage. If the shove critically succeeded and moved them through the Wall of Fire, they might now take another bit of damage coming out. Or they might have gone around it, and then you shove them right back through, and now they have to choose. Are they going to come out, or are they going to go around it? Likewise for Corrosive Muck, Rust Cloud. A lot of these spells can be combined with force movement to double dip, triple dip on damage. That being said, Force movement is one of the hazier rules in Pathfinder. At a baseline, every GM will let the use of the shove action push an enemy into dangerous terrain, because allowing shove to do so is rules as written with no ambiguity. Anything beyond that can be ambiguous. GMs have different interpretations. Some will allow acid grip to move them into damaging areas, others will not. So make sure that this is something you communicate with your GM before going for it. If instead of the damage being based on where the enemy started or entered, it happens on a sustain that you do, then coordinate with your friends to use frontline options to keep enemies in the same area as much as possible. Reactions, trips, difficult terrain, all of these can funnel enemies into narrow kill zones that you can then use with these spells, where every time you sustain, you're hitting as many of them as possible. If another character in the party is playing a hard controller, because you're more of a zoner, you're applying these soft control spells, but if somebody else is casting Wall of Stone, you can combo into a default kill. By default kill, what I mean is you have something that is going to do damage every single turn, like Corrosive Muck or Wall of Fire. They have locked the enemy in. If the enemy does not figure a way out, they just die right there. Now, most enemies will figure some or the other way out, even out of something as powerful as a Wall of Stone, but that'll still buy your party a lot of time to set up some buffs, deal with other enemies, divide and conquer, and once the enemy comes out, they'll have taken a bunch of damage for coming out. And finally, some of these spells inflict two-way concealed or other debuffs on anyone who's trying to attack into it, even if they're not standing in the area. There are options that can help with that. You can buy your party gauze masks. You can ask them to pick up the blind fight feat, which is just a good feat even without you having to ask them. Of course, you can also just not worry about the DC 5 flat check. A 20% chance that goes two ways kind of cancels out, and the damage the enemy usually takes for staying in that area outweighs the damage you would lose from the dazzle. So these are just some of the ways you can use zoning in conjunction with good communication, planning, and preparation for maximum effect. When taken to an extreme, this can look amazing. Freezing Rain, the first 3 actions you spend on it, all they do is create difficult terrain. If you're in a coordinated party where that difficult terrain is now weaponized, where enemies are forced to trudge through it or around it to get to you, that was basically a no-save slowed 1 or slowed 2 on turn 1 for everyone on the other side of the field. And then that same Freezing Rain is going to start damaging them and imposing slowed and potentially still stranding them in difficult terrain if they haven't gotten close to you already. So well-coordinated zoning blasts will far exceed the value of any normal blast if you know how to use them well. If your party is unable to or unwilling to coordinate to use these as well as possible, I would recommend not using them. Because at that point, they're probably not generating as much value as a normal blast anyways, and they have a chance of getting in your friend's way. One thing to note, some one-shot AoE blasts can be so big that they basically require zoning tactics anyways, like Eclipse Burst. Eclipse Burst, Falling Stars, spells like these are so big that unless your friends are proactively helping you land them, you're probably going to hit a friend with them. So it's best to avoid them if you don't have a coordinated party. Now for a table etiquette issue rather than a tactics issue. I just talked about Falling Stars, Eclipse Burst, and all the zoning spells that are hard for your party to play around. They require coordination and efficiency, which you can't ask of every party. If they say no, table etiquette dictates that you should probably just not pick those spells, or only use them in exceptional circumstances. That being said, there's a flip side of this issue too. I have seen time and time again comments and posts on Reddit talking about how Fireball is a bad spell because you're only going to hit one target with it. The rest of them are mixed up with your melee allies. That is, unfortunately, not a mechanical issue. That is your allies being rude. And there is no fix for that other than communicating with the other players at your table. If you're unable to communicate with them, please just send them this rant at this timestamp, and I will implore them on your behalf to not get in your way for AoEs. First, just pure table etiquette. If somebody came here to cast spells, please let them cast spells. It's not hard to not get in the way of your friend's 20-foot bursts. 20-foot bursts are pretty small. Even in a very cramped AP map, you can usually just aim them in a corner of the room and they won't flare out till your friends. The only reason they would hit a friend is if you're doing something silly, like one of you is standing here, the other one is standing here, and you're like, ooh, flanking, I'm never gonna move from here. Please move from there. Please stand something like this so that your caster can catch everyone here rather than standing like this, and now the caster is only catching one enemy off in the corner. It is just bad etiquette to prioritize getting a +2 to your hit effectively over your ally getting to cast their iconic spells. And the other factor is that a lot of people argue it is optimal to do this and to deprioritize the AoE, and that is often based off of those arguments in the first section of this video, the ones I debunked of AoEs being bad. Quite simply, AoEs are the best way to deal with multi-target situations. In an ideal world, this wouldn't need saying, but AoEs are kinda lackluster in a lot of other D20 games, so people don't expect them to be good in this game. AoEs are the best way of dealing with multi-target situations. Nothing you're gaining from standing in flanking position is going to outweigh that. The -2 to the enemy's AC is not outweighing that. Getting an additional strike that you made at map is not going to outweigh that. In fact, it is so severely not going to outweigh the AoE that if you choose not to get out of the way, it's actually more optimal for the spellcaster to fireball you than to try and avoid you and hit fewer targets, because that's how good AoEs are when they actually hit multiple targets. It will make the party more likely to survive, even though it makes you less likely to survive. So the next time you refuse to get out of the way of an AoE, consider that your ally is doing you a big favor by not just AoEing you right in the face. And now I'm giving them permission to do that if you don't get out of the way. Let's get back to tactics, shall we? As I said, in most situations, you could place a 20-foot burst or something of a similar size fairly easily to avoid hitting allies as long as they haven't gotten in your way. But sometimes you can't. What if you're indoors in a 10-foot by 10-foot room? Your ally is occupying a very important position, the choke point that prevents enemies from coming out of that room. Where do you position your fireball now? Even if you place the fireball in the furthest back corner of the room, a 20-foot burst is still going to emanate out towards your ally. And as I said, the ally can't move. They'd be putting you and other party members at risk by moving, so they do need to stay in this specific place right now. So what now? How do you avoid them? The trick here is that bursts do not need to be on the ground. You can center them in the air. So what happens if you center the fireball 10 feet above the ground, on the ceiling of the room you're in, which is probably at least 10 feet high realistically? Now the fireball's projection on the ground is going to be smaller. It's not going to be a 20-foot burst. It's just going to be a 15-foot burst, which is not going to reach your ally along that diagonal axis. So even in the most cramped of rooms, as long as you have a ceiling, you can still make do and not hit your allies. And conversely, outdoors, you might be in situations where an eclipse burst or something equally large would have hit your ally when centered on the ground, but when you centered in the air, it's not going to hit your ally anymore. Now, there might be some resistance to the idea because how do you calculate this mid-session? It's easy for me to say from behind my computer that a 20-foot burst becomes a 15-foot burst when you raise it 10 feet off the ground, but that's not obvious. How do you calculate this? And recently I did a poll on Reddit about how often you use airbursting, and not wanting to calculate it mid-session was one of the most common complaints about airbursting. Thing is, the situation for airbursting comes up relatively rarely. It's not going to come up all the time. I played through all of Abomination Vaults, known for having cramped spaces, and I still only airburst a handful of times. When the situation comes up, it's quite important. You should talk to your GM about this because, yeah, it might be a little annoying to have to calculate it, but like, it's important. Like, you still want to use your AoEs. This is going to come up rarely. It's going to matter when it comes up. It's kind of like looking up an important rule when life or death is on the line. It's okay to stall your game for an important enough thing as long as you don't do it all the time. That being said, there are some solutions and rules of thumb that you can apply that help make airbursting easier. Firstly, if there is no meaningful vertical limit, if you're outdoors, for example, you can shrink any spell to have half of its radius by moving it upwards an arbitrary amount. To be clear, this is a bare minimum. There are plenty of bursts that can be shrank down more than this, but there's no burst in the game that won't at least half in size if you place it all the way up. A 10-foot burst can be made into a 5-foot burst if you place it above the ground. A 60-foot burst can also become a 30-foot burst if you place it somewhere above the ground. So as a GM, if there is no vertical limit for where you center the burst, simply allow it to be reduced anywhere down up till half the radius of the original burst. Next, if there is a vertical limit, ask your GM to make their best judgment call and just don't slow the game down. Most GMs will probably let you hand wave it as something like, there are 3 targets. You can only hit all 3 by hitting one friend, but you can hit 2 without hitting a friend if that's what you want. GMs hand wave stuff all the time. I think it's fair to expect them to hand wave or something like this too whenever necessary. And if it's absolutely life or death, if there is a vertical limit, or if you need to shrink it down below half radius, and you simply cannot accept the GM's hand wave, it's time for Pythagoras theorem. Sorry, gang. It's not a particularly hard formula, thankfully. Basically, the formula is lowercase r is equal to the square root of uppercase r squared minus h squared. Here, uppercase r is the burst's original radius, h is the height you positioned it above the ground, and lowercase r is the radius of the cross-section of that burst on the ground. Take that answer, round it down to the nearest 5-foot increment, and you have the radius of this shrunk burst. For example, in the previous slide, I talked about the 20-foot burst. It was 10 feet above the ground. That, with this formula, gives 17.32, which you round down to 15 feet. Just always round down. That is standard for how bursts will operate in this game. Now, I understand this is math. This is annoying math. Not everyone wants to do math this complicated at a table. Pathfinder already sometimes asks for complex math. There's no need to make it worse. So here is what I'm going to do. I'm going to present you with a handy dandy chart. This covers 6 different standard sizes for bursts: 10-foot, 20-foot, 30-foot, 40-foot, 50-foot, and 60-foot bursts. Then each row is a different height you have placed each of these bursts at. For example, if you go to the 15-foot row, you're saying a 20-foot burst placed 15 feet above the ground has a 10-foot radius on the ground. A 10-foot burst has no radius, it's too far up. A 30-foot burst has a 25-foot radius. All I've done here is taken the formula from the previous slide and just use it to populate this table. You can use it as a quick reference. If you're a blaster player who finds yourself having to avoid allies in cramped indoor spaces, often print this chart out, show it to your GM and say, hey, can I just use this as a reference for shrinking my AOEs as long as you can tell me how high the ceiling is? And I think most GMs will agree with it, and your party members will be happy with it too. So this can serve as a quick reference, and if something doesn't fall into reference, back to Pythagoras theorem we go. Ultimately, airbursting is a really valuable tactic. It can help you aim AoEs in a much more ally-friendly manner in situations where they may not otherwise be ally-friendly. So it's always worth thinking about airbursting and how it might help you include more targets while excluding your allies. The last piece of tactical advice for blasters that I have in this video: one-shot single-target spells and how to use them. What does one-shot mean? It means a spell that does all its damage in one go rather than something like Floating Flame or Cinder Swarm. And we're talking about single target spells that do this, like Thunder Strike. One-shot single target blasts are rarely ever going to be your first pick for any circumstance. Think about it. First, we have already talked about how in multi-target fights, kill confirms are not best landed via such spells. It's best to still AoE just in case that kills a target and damages somebody else, or just in case you fail to kill the target but still get damage on others. In the rare case where you do need single target damage to land a kill confirm, which is only going to happen if you have reverse engineered the enemy's HP with a high degree of certainty, attack spells are what you want to use and not saving throw spells. Why is that? Because Sure Strike and hero points can give you fortune on that attack roll. Allies can give you various bonuses on that attack roll and penalties to the enemy's AC much more easily than they can give you penalties to the enemy's save. So attack spells are likely to land that hit or critical hit needed to kill a target, whereas, say, tossing a Thunder Strike over there might not do the trick. The existence of AoE riders also means that anytime a situation comes up where the party really wants you to focus fire one of many targets, you can still try to AoE everyone else while doing it. You can still try to use Cinder Swarm, Lightning Bolt, Chain Lightning, and still be focusing fire while also AoEing everyone else. These factors combined mean that one-shot single-target blasts are almost entirely relegated to situations where you only have one target. But there's an exception there too. If the reason for you only having one target is because 3 other targets died and that's the last one left, you're not going to use a slotted spell on this. Go use a cantrip or something. Don't bother with a slotted spell. So all of these combined means you are exclusively using single target one-shot spells in boss fights. Plan accordingly. Pick your one-shot single target spells with the assumption that you're always throwing them at a boss, because you probably are. First, be able to target at least 2 saves. Always avoid the highest save. Now, these are standard pieces of advice, but they're more important to follow for a boss. In multi-target situations, you could get away with targeting the highest save and still do some good damage. Ideally, you really want to be trying to target the lowest save, so maybe try using Recall Knowledge or have an ally use Recall Knowledge, or perhaps some other skill action like Demoralize or Trip to test for the enemy's lowest save. If your party has a bard or someone else who's really good at boosting attack roll spells, like say a one-for-all swashbuckler, make sure to use attack roll spells, because you'll disproportionately benefit from hits and crits that these spells get much more frequently than a saving throw spell would get fails and crit fails. Then, make sure you focus on relevant riders. Something like Vision of Death that can do a mini fireball to one target while also inflicting Frightened? Great. Ignite Fireworks for dazzling an enemy while dealing some damage? Amazing. Ash Cloud for zoning away a boss, doing some persisting damage, and potentially blinding them? Great. And if you can find a spell that has a rider that directly takes away an action, that becomes even more valuable. Something like Mist Q at higher levels, which is like an upgraded version of Vision of Death that also slows enemies, is amazing to cast on a boss. So think about relevant riders, because these riders inflate in value against a scarier opponent. And finally, and this is more important than a lot of the other things, have a way to weaponize your third action reliably. If you're an elemental sorcerer, you have elemental toss. If you're a Silence the Snow Witch, you have your Hex cantrip that does a little bit of damage. A lot of blasters operate off of good weaponized third actions. If you don't naturally have a focus spell or focus cantrip that lets you do that, think about other options. Think about opening with a 3-action spell and sustaining it on future rounds. Think about just carrying a plain old weapon. That might be useful. So these are the general guidelines on how to use one-shot single-target spells. First, understand that they're almost always going to be used on bosses, and then second, be prepared to use them on bosses in these 4 ways. So that will be all for today's video, folks. I hope you found these guidelines helpful. All of these tactics, I'll be honest, I was not planning on making a video this long. The initial plan was just the math part and a little bit about focus fire, and somehow it snowballed into this. Regardless, I think this would be helpful advice for a lot of players, and I hope you found it helpful. If you liked this video, please like, comment, and subscribe. Maybe you could check out some of my other videos, like the cards I linked throughout this video. If you can afford to, please join a channel membership. It's a great way to directly support me. It'll give you 3 different benefits. The first, you'll get early access to many of my videos. Secondly, you will get access to written build guides in the cases of videos where I create builds, and then you'll be able to recreate these builds at home without having to rewatch the whole video. The first of these guides is already up. Funnily enough, the accompanying video is not out yet because that is going to be Blastercaster Part 3, but that'll come out soon. And the third and final reason to join a channel membership is because it'll make me really happy, and I'd really appreciate it if it did. This kind of support is what helps me keep going with this channel. I have been Mathfinder, folks, and I will see you next time.